All right. Welcome everyone. I think we'll go ahead and get started because it's depending where you are. It's one p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. In perhaps UK time or something. Um, and Today we're going to be um, having a discussion about culture and systems at the time of the fifth joint point. The session's from 1 to 2:45. We'll have Carla Groom, Andy Wilkins, and Waldemar Schmidt talking. Carla is going to go for about 25 minutes, Andy roughly 20 minutes, and Waldemar about 10 to 15. And then the rest of the time will be for Q&A. I would ask if possible, I'll be monitoring the Q&A for actual questions. So if you can, I know the habit may be to put everything in chat, but if we could try to put some of those things in Q&A, so chat stays more of a back and forth in real time. Carla will be using her extensive experience in the UK public sector to show the delivery public and state services and how they can be reimagined with more advanced approaches with links to UTOK. Andy will briefly look at the fifth joint point and the meta crisis before dropping down into healthcare futures. And Waldemar will be addressing some of the important cultural differences and implications of UTOK. So Carla is going to go first. I want to briefly introduce her. Dr. Carla Groom is a deputy director and head of the Human-Centered Design Science at the Department of Work and Pensions, DWP. Her lifelong passion is to make people's lives better by supporting improved decision-making processes within individuals and organizations. After studying psychology, where did my little notes go? After studying psychology at Cambridge University, she completed a PhD in social psychology at Northwestern University in the US and held a postdoctorate position at the University of Texas in Austin. During this time, she published more than a dozen papers. She joined the civil service in 2006 to work in automatic enrollment into workplace pensions, the largest application of psychological thinking in policy making at that time. 2015, she created a team at the DWP, originally branded as behavioral science. Its purpose was to improve decisions made early in the design of policies and processes. Using her experience in the government, industry, and academia, she's pioneered a set of practices which draw on social science, human-centered design, and systems thinking, teamwork across the span of DWP policies and operational delivery, contributing to policies and processes that better achieve intended goals. She's done work with Jim Ruth and Jordan Hall at the Consilience Conference last year under the old behavioral science brand. And this year we'll be sharing key learnings from the team's 9-year journey, but with more updated thinking, included things from UTOK. So with that, Carla, please take it away.
Oh, thank you so much. I know I gave you a lot of information to share then, but you shared that beautifully. Thank you. I imagine that some of the folks in the audience might have seen my presentation last year. And that was with, can you see the slides okay?
We see them.
Okay, great. So this is the brief that Greg gave me was to sort of recap the stuff I did on visions of society and government and governance with Jim and Max and Jordan Hall. And during that, but this time he wants me to connect it to UTOK. So last year, I talked about the unusual team of social scientists that I have created and led for the last 9 years deep inside the largest policymaking operational department and ministry of the UK government. I talked about how we were partly inspired by something that the government got really right, which was that program whereby now all employees, when they start a job, their employer will put them into a pension scheme with an employer contribution, and individuals can opt out if it isn't right for them. And this was a massive undertaking and a huge success. And studying the factors that led to that success have been partly the inspiration for what my team has been up to. I also talked about a case study supporting people who are caregivers to stay in work and combine caring and work for longer. I then had went a bit theoretical and thought, why is it that we tend not to have successful policy making? Why does things tend to go wrong, to not achieve their goals? And one of the hypotheses I shared was about mechanistic mental models as a barrier to effective governance. I then put forward some fairly practical suggestions, almost akin to the Agile Manifesto, of practices that we should do less of and ones that we should do more of if we want to have fewer blunders and unsolved problems, and to increase the chances of us having more successes like automatic enrollment and whatever the future is going to throw at us. So I then said my emerging vision for conscious civil service. That's probably a bit of a overstatement, because really what I said was, I think we need a conscious civil service, and then let Jordan figure out what that meant for me. So I'm going to say some of the same things today in more detail. A year is a long time in my team. We have continued to get involved in real world problems, as well as dialogue with lots of wonderful thinkers around the world, and watching other people having dialogue. So I'm going to be drawing here particularly a couple of links to wonderful series that John and Jordan did on the future of governance, which wasn't quite out by the time of the conference last year, but I have listened to it over and over and over, and it's packed full of useful stuff. There's also been a couple of sessions that have come out that I've done with John, including one on mental models that I wanted to reference. Obviously, I don't get to talk about all of this today because I now have 21 minutes and 44 seconds. One of the I guess the challenges of this particular talk is that most of these insights are bottom up and empirically derived. So I've started with problems, practical problems in delivering effective governance. But that means that it could be quite difficult to know, well, why has what you've done worked? Which bits of it scale, which don't? Can you come up with frameworks that help you to avoid the blind spots that your approaches have overcome? So could UTOK be a way of providing top-down theoretical clarity that could help us to explain, refine, scale learning about next generation governance capability? And to do that, I'm going to make a few links to UTOK, but I know that there's plenty of people in the audience who know far more than I do, and will understand lots of bits of it, particularly things like the justification part of it that I haven't properly got to grips with. Behavioral investment theory I have a bit of a grip on. The tree of knowledge is probably the bit I feel most comfortable with. But I'm really, really, really keen that people share their thoughts and reactions. And, well, you're talking about this, it sounds like it belongs in that part of the theory. And the beauty of the privilege of my position is that I can take stuff away and actually try and see if it makes things better. So this is a standard slide that I have presented gazillions of times. And in fact, you're getting the same presentation that I would give to our incoming ministers. And it says our basic idea that our team came along with in 2015 was informed by an analysis of the policymaking process. And very, very simply, our ministers set goals. The DWP, which is the Department for Work and Pensions, which is the bit that I work in, which covers things like regulation of the private pension system, social security, welfare benefits, a whole range of stuff in the sort of work and money area. So DWP does some stuff, creates some strategies, systems, internal processes. And then when you've done that stuff and you've changed the world a bit, you see that real people respond to that world, whether that's our own staff who are administering benefits, whether it's people who are claiming our benefits, whether it's, say, it's a doctor, a physician writing a fit note because somebody is too sick to do the job they were doing or is now more fit to do something else. And then our army of analysts, and we're very, very lucky in DWP to have the most incredible group of social researchers, economists, statisticians, and operational researchers. They measure our outcomes. And when you get a gap between what you're trying to do on the left and what you get on the right, it's pretty tempting to think that the problem lies in the choices that people are making in the third box. I say, if only we could get people to do this and that, then it would be okay. And that's the temptation that when they hear the term behavioral science, they think, oh, you're going to help me to get people to behave other than where I've incentivized them to behave. I'm like, no, I have no magic beans. I'm really sorry. You've been misled. And eventually I ended up rebranding away from behavioral science because it led people to try and put us into that third box when really what our whole shtick is why are we not looking at the thing that is under our control, which is the decisions that we make in creating the systems, strategies and internal processes in the first place? That is in our gift. The way people respond to that is much less in our gift. You can push them around a bit with comms, but if you really want to close the gap between the first box and the last box, then really you need to look at how do you make those design decisions at the fundamental heart of government. So our problem statement for our team that we said we are here as a group of social scientists, slightly rogue social scientists, to solve is that DWP sometimes makes decisions based on inaccurate assumptions about people. And that contains two elements. One is we tend to get things wrong about people in particular. And it's relatively easy to say, why are you assuming people are going to fill in a form that way? It doesn't make much sense. So let's provide some user-centered thinking. But actually, the idea that we're making decisions based on inaccurate assumptions about anything suggests there's something wrong with our decision-making process. And I'm particularly excited about that part. And in UTOK terms, what you can see is really the outcomes. Those could be at the bottom level of the tree of knowledge, because it could even be things like climate change, could be things that are actually physical, as well as economic outcomes, health outcomes. The second level there, the third box is really about the sort of the mind level, and behavioral investment theory will be the approach to what I was really trying to say when I said to policymakers, no, hold on, people are going to behave the way they've been incentivized to behave because their decisions are governed by behavioral investment theory. But it seems to me that this third, if you go up the level to the culture person plane, that's when you're getting into these decision-making processes that we're not actually conscious of within government. How do you think and change those? Because it seems that is where the area for change and improvement and solution making really is. And I could also go on, but I won't, about how I think I bridge the is-ought divide, which I was pleased to hear John Vervaeke say is a false divide. I'm like, phew, because that was a problem for me as a scientist trying to come up with the way that we should do things, was actually say the democratic process bridges that divide by saying what ministers say is the should, is the ought. And you can explore that scientifically. It's like, okay, let's properly understand what you care about and why you care about it, and why you're setting what outcomes most important to you, particularly when you've got trade-offs. So there's a number of places in this core slide that I think UTOK can help us to understand why this is useful to us. So if we take it back to my team, what's the what here? Well, the what is that we're here to change design decisions rather than shift people's choices. And the why is because we want to tackle the existing weaknesses, future risks in policy making, operational delivery, especially due to increasing complexity and uncertainty that we're facing in the 21st century and towards the fifth joint point. So if we now look at the how, this is I'm not going to go through this table in great detail, but this is a bit of a sort of summary of our current mixture of people that we hire, people we find are most able to do this sort of work, the kinds of mindsets they have, the sort of training they have, the technical tools that we find putting them in their hands gives us the biggest bang for buck, and the operating conditions that allow that to work. I'm just realizing that the way in which this is working, I can't actually see the whole slide because the pictures of me and everyone else are in the way of the slide. I don't know how to fix that. Is anybody can give me a really quick bit of tech support on that? Because I can't read my own slides. Andrew, are you around?
I'm not sure. You may be able to slide that over a little bit or minimize it. It's hard for us to see your view. So we see the slides completely.
Yeah, so I can't read them. That's a bit of a problem.
Oh, I see.
I'm in government. I'm used to using Teams. So, okay, if I move that out of the way, so I'm going to move that here. Sorry about that, guys. Bear with me 1 second.
Yeah, no worries.
Because that is very annoying. And then if I do play, okay. That's better than nothing. Okay, so the academic training, we bring people from pretty much every social scientific discipline except economics, because economics is already very well integrated. And we were there to provide a bit of what could we do with the underrepresented disciplines in government? More important than, well, really social scientific training is useful, but what I'm really looking for when I hire people is a bunch of mindsets that are actually probably negatively correlated. And I suspect that that's probably some negative correlation in the actual population, but a lot of it is because our educational systems are driving people in one direction or another. So finding people who have that scientific mindset that can really critically engage with evidence, can spot inconsistencies and fallacies, can think philosophically, have the empathy and can do the perspective taking with others, can genuinely lead people through a collaborative dialogous process, who can do the systems thinking and zoom out and use systems thinking to work out what's relevant to a problem, as well as taking a design approach and really rolling up your sleeves and actually taking action in the world with all the uncertainties involved in that. There's not too many people who are comfortable with all 5 of those things. And it's a bit of a needle in a haystack to find people who can do that, and the sort of first principles thinking that is also implied there. And so a lot of the people that I hire end up being neurodivergent. I'm autistic. Many of my team have ADHD, dyspraxia, dyslexia, which makes me even more interested in the question of what about this does this scale? Because I've built a very special team that doesn't scale, that can do some stuff, but can we take the results of what we found and turn those into general principles that are scalable? And then I tend to talk about the tools that we use in terms of the magic fusion really being systems thinking to think about what's relevant, scientific things to make sure that you're not being biased and that you're checking, not that you're finding out things that are true, but obviously that you're rejecting things that are false, and design thinking in order to bring about change in the world in a systematic, sensible, collaborative way. And then I've mentioned a couple of other tools that we use as well. The operating conditions of my team are really, really important. So you could put all those tools in the hands of these really great people, but in the dominant culture and mental models of the government, it's actually really difficult for them to do the things that I'm about to talk about. So I sort of create a little bubble within the civil service, highly supportive, lots of teams highly supportive, but mine's highly supportive. But it's problem-centered rather than method-centered. So it's not about what you can do. It's about the problems you're here to solve. It's transdisciplinary rather than multidisciplinary. It's about finding crossing the bridges between the boundaries of problems and disciplines. It's about a forensic rigor. So really, really kind of starting to pull things apart and not being satisfied with partial answers. Empathy, curiosity, and openness in the way that you deal with others, and a pioneering spirit such that when you've got a choice between doing something that is copied and pasted from a previous, we use precedent, which is really valuable a lot of the time. When you're doing a tactical solution that is just in time and will solve the problem, we choose to find something that is original, bespoke, and has lasting value. So I'm deliberately setting incentives up that are different from those that are normally present in our organization and lots of other organizations. And that, combined with the tools and the people, leads to really powerful outcomes. So just revisiting this slide from last year, talking about dominant mental models as our biggest barriers. And one of the amazing skills that I have inside my team is I have a cartoonist who managed to channel her frustration at the mechanistic mental models of Taylorism, and the extent to which the way that we think about people and problems inside a bureaucracy implies that things are steady state, that they work like a machine, and that not rather than something that is organic. And this is not really this isn't really helping us. It isn't leading us to do the recursive relevance realization properly. In fact, it's doing the reverse. It's leading us to frame problems in terms that are static and mechanistic, which then leads us to look for solutions in those, and it doesn't solve the problems because the ontology doesn't really match. So we need to find ways to lead people to frame problems in such a way that it draws their attention to the right parts of the problem. So at the moment, I'd say that those sorts of models are not really fit for purpose. I'm not the only person saying this. I'm not the only person practicing different approaches in government. But as a general historical reality, I think this is something a lot of people would recognise. And the problem with this caricatured system is that it could be a system where people making rational individual choices, as behavioural investment theory would suggest, but they are doing collectively things that systematically diverge from the intended outcomes. So you end up with a government that is, in practical terms, irrational. And I think a lot of the ideas that we've heard about today sort of speak to that. In terms of the fifth joint point, there's an interesting question for me about how the digitization of processes that are involved in government could free up humans to do the sort of judgment-based choice making that we'd love to see instead of rule following. And this is where that first episode of the Jordan John conversation was so useful, where they talked about humans being really good at choice making and being very poor at being pseudo machines following processes and rules. So have the machines do that. But I've been worrying more recently about when you start to have machines aggregate previous human judgments and say, okay, well, in most situations faced with this evidence, a human would have decided that this person qualified for, for this benefit, or would be admissible for this job. Maybe the person on the other end of that, who starts to make decisions based on that information, treats it as something that is more objective than it is. So you've taken a bunch of collective, nuanced, context-dependent, messy human judgments, fed it through a bunch of algorithms, and suddenly it starts to feel like an independent source of information. So I worry that actually we become less inclined to apply our human judgment rather than more inclined. And that feels like a choice that we can make, and that if we can find the right ways to intervene in the application of automation and the human interaction with those automated processes, we have a real opportunity to avoid a risk and take and make something better. And can UTOK help us to think about the conditions under which we go down the one path or the other? So I've been trying over the last year, especially since ditching the behavioural science brand, to think about why do those sets of capabilities that I've talked about seem to be an antidote to the problems I just talked about, and the broad analysis of the problem that I talked about in that 4-box model. And some of the I did sort of hypotheses have come up with is that those tools and perspectives help you to draw out and integrate multiple perspectives on complex problems, helps you to reframe the problems and thereby ask the right questions, which analysts can then answer to reveal solutions. And actually getting the question right is something that I think has been undervalued. I think that our approaches lead us to zoom into what I call the mucky local detail of why somebody that we're supporting back into work can't take a job, because it would mean that she'd have to get her say a young mother has to get her buggy onto a bus at 8 a.m. in order to take her kid to childcare and then go to work, but you can't because the bus is full. It's those sorts of things that don't tend to make it into policy analysis that really matter. So both zooming into that mucky detail, but also out to the big picture of, hold on, not just the bits of the government that my department owns, but actually the whole government and then other bits of societal infrastructure that all support, say, that young woman trying to find a job. I think our methods help us to enable coordinated action to address those reframed problems. And to say all of that in much less jargon, I think my team are gently intervening in the decision-making infrastructure to improve it. But would love other ideas on what I've been up to, because I do a thing. And when people say, what is you do? It's like, I don't know. I wouldn't confess that into too many audiences, but I think you guys can hold that space for me. So that is a whole lot of theory, and I'm going to use the last few minutes to talk about a case study so you know what the hell this actually means in practice. So this is, the North American term is caregivers, the British term is carers. And so we were asked back in 2017, how can we help people who take on caregiving responsibilities to remain in work? Because we know that thousands of people every year in the UK feel forced to give up promotions, drop out of work to look after somebody who's become sick or disabled, usually a family member. And they wish that they hadn't and they didn't want to, but they feel like they've got no choice. And it tends not to be very good for their long-term health or finances. They often never come back. Women in their 50s and 60s tend to be the ones who are disproportionately likely to do this. And they're already ones whose pensions and earnings have been set back by the time of having children. And with an aging population, the scale of this challenge is only going to increase. So there was a decent consensus that there was a problem. And so the policy lead came to me and said, could you see if you could do something about this? So what we did, we started off thinking about the process by which somebody would drop out. And the way in which the department had previously thought about this was, say this lady, Caroline, requests some flexible working for employer. Her employer refuses her request. So she goes, oh, well, then I've got to quit. And so the natural place the policymaker would go is, well, we need to talk to employers about providing flexible working. And that's not necessarily wrong, but are we missing other bits of the journey here? So we did some more thinking about, hold on, what happened before she got to that point? And we thought about her father, Dave, who is the one that she's looking after. He develops care needs. So she makes a bunch of decisions, probably on the hoof, and probably for a bunch of conflicting questions about emotions and sense of responsibility and information for medics. And she makes these decisions about caring for her dad, how to combine care and work, and then sort of muddles along, and then things get worse or unmanageable. Then she asks for flexible working. It's probably too late. And that by the time you get to that point, she's actually committed herself in so many ways that it is very difficult for her to stay and work. So the bigger insight from this is that carer and caring isn't actually a group that you're in or out of. It isn't a static demographic category. It's a complex social practice. It's very much culture plain stuff, but it's not being treated that. It's treated as, oh, well, this is at the level of the person. And a portion of her user journey had been neglected. So our hypothesis was that people make these early decisions without really understanding their needs, entitlements, or the longer term implications of those decisions. And we did a bunch of research and a bunch of co-design work. And I would normally have this as a list, but since this is this audience, I put it into Wilbur's 4 quadrants to show that actually we had covered all the bases here. We had developed some insight into what it was like for these potential pre-carers before they started to identify as carers and before things got so bad for them that they dropped out of work. We got some understanding of what their ideal user journey really would be that would lead them to have better outcomes and evidence about the barriers to them taking that up. We put together a motivated and supportive group of stakeholders from charities, local authorities, as well as departments across government. And we had a map of the systemic causes and impacts of this problem. So we had developed a different framing and understanding of the problem and a group of people willing to do something about it. And the results of this is ongoing work. But here's a couple of samples, a leaflet that we did during COVID, because we thought lots of people are going to become carers. They're not going to know they're carers. And we can use this opportunity for the NHS to give them some information to say, actually, if you've got dealing with somebody who's got care needs, you've got some rights, you've got some support. Because one of the things we noticed is that people didn't access the support that's out there for carers until it was too late. Because if they were working, they didn't think of themselves as carers. We also have put some more detailed information up on government's websites, which helps people to think about those early stages of conversations with their families, with the medics, as well as with their employers. So what are the overall reflections from this whole 9 years of work, of which I have given you a sample? So our hope sort of remains that we can build a conscious civil service that is actually making decisions and judgments rather than following formal processes. I was very struck by what John said, that you can't deal with radical uncertainty using formal systems. You can only deal with risk. And I thought that's exactly right. And can we use the transitions that are involved in the technological upgrading of our processes to do something better? And from last year, what I shared was this sort of my version of an agile manifesto of dial down the answering of questions and dial up the forming of better questions, dialing down specialist language, dialing up finding common language, PowerPoint reports, replace those with visualizations. She says, well, I'm giving you a PowerPoint report. Justification construction was in the list last year, but I realize it doesn't belong in a list like that. It's a different kind of thing. But it is definitely a massive sucker of a lot of time. If you don't have everything aligned in a bureaucracy, you spend all your time creating justifications, which in themselves are not that useful to the electorate and to taxpayer. Quantification is useful, but we need to do more holistic contextual research. My team usually only does qualitative research. Can we move away from precedent and standardization to sense and respond mechanisms? From prediction to think about causality, from behavior change to think about systems change. And I've added a couple more for this year. Can we move away from sort of rationalizing in the Freudian sense to a metamodern rationality in the more Platonic sense? Can we move away from action based on probabilistic risk and towards choices based on certainty? Can we move away from blue and orange leadership in the spiral dynamic sense to teal and turquoise leadership? And I don't have any magic bullets, but I have some ideas and I'd love yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Carla. And I think we'll save the questions and answers for after the talks, but that was spot on. And a lot of things come to mind based on, I'd like to copy you and put you around a lot of places. All right. So next, Andy Wilkins will go. Andy is based in London, UK, and is a futurist speaker, podcaster, and founder of The Future of Health, a new think tank and systems convener exploring long-term vision for holistic health in a technology-enabled 21st century. Throughout his career, he's undertaken numerous innovation projects across multiple sectors, authored high-profile reports for the UK's NHS and policymakers. A core interest for Andy has been the question of what do we mean by value? Value not in the financial sense, but in the sense of why our technique and institutions need to transfer from value extraction to value creation, i.e. to be in service of what truly matters and to contribute in a flourishing humanity on a flourishing planet. As some might know, going from a game A to game B. Andy chairs and speaks at many international conferences on these themes and their connection to the meta and meaning crisis. He has recently been appointed as program director for the Imperial College's executive education course on leading systemic innovation in healthcare, and also a visiting lecturer at UCL. So with that, Andy, go for it. Let's hear what you got.
Great. Can you hear me?
We hear you just fine.
Great. Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Baron. And thank you very much, Carla, for that sort of deep insight into the thinking of government and some of the great ideas of how to bring change to the structure and thinking and action inside large institutions. What I'm going to be talking about is perhaps going up a level and sort of viewing institutions from the outside, looking at them more holistically. And that's a lot of the work that I do. And there are some observations I would like to share with you in this talk. We're going to cover quite a lot of ground, so buckle up. We're going for a fast ride through a lot of content here, but hopefully I can do it some justice and spark some interest in conversation. So yeah, we're here to really sort of think about this fifth join point. This is what Greg asked us to think about, which is if we move out of this sort of social cultural plane that we've been now into a technology empowered future, what does that mean? How do we think about that? There's a huge amount of uncertainty. We could stumble into it. But I think we're already seeing a lot of crises build out around the world, and we can see some storm clouds coming. So I wanted to try and speak a little bit to that. I won't have all the answers, but I just wanted to give some framing to that. One of the approaches that I found quite useful is Forrest Landry's metaphysics, which I think fits in quite nicely with what UTOK is talking about. And Forrest talks about the sort of triads. I mean, one of his themes, if people know him, is there's a lot of triples that he brings together. But when we're talking about the sort of right up at the metaphysical level, he talks about ontology, the what is, the epistemology, how do we know, and the sort of series of and the sort of theories of justification that we can have for our actions. But he also brings in as an important loop here axiology. Why should we care about the justifications and the decisions we're making? And if we treat that why do we care seriously, it can point us back more deeply into understanding the ontology and the epistemology. And we get a sort of dynamic circle, if you like, that these things are self-reinforcing. Now, why I think this is important in the time of the meta crisis is that we can justify all sorts of things. Pragmatism will tell us we can do all sorts of things that will generate the outcomes we seek at a local level. But as we start to look at things like the meta crisis and the total action of all that we're dealing with, we start to hit some sort of existential questions that then bring us back to a higher order need to think about why should we care? What does value mean? And how do we bring an axiological element to our thinking that may have only existed in a bottom-up manner, but may need to come down from a top-down manner because the very greater systems that we're part of are now under threat. So I just want to put that on the table. It was mentioned this morning, Shayla's hierarchy of value. And I think this is really important to think about. So just to summarize quickly, Shayla put it at the bottom of this pyramid, utility and usefulness. The satisfying of basic needs and wants. Above that, higher order values he put as virtues such as courage, loyalty, humility, prudence, compassion, that those should be in service of even higher order values, which is wisdom, broadly construed, and justice, beauty, truth, goodness, learning, and that those are also in service to an even higher one, which is the sacredness or interconnectedness of all things, the sort of coherence and viability of an entire sort of interconnected being, if you like. And I put on here a couple of boxes that really are McGilchrist's view here, that the right hemisphere, which is looking at the Gestalt, tends to value Shaler's, will seek to orient itself to the hierarchy as Shaler has laid out, the interconnectedness of all things, the coherence and the sustainability of all things, does point to a value hierarchy that ascends in the way that Shaler has indicated. But left hemisphere thinking, if you're familiar with McGilchrist's work, which is about grasping and getting, inverts that pyramid and really sees utility as being the most valuable thing in the world. And what we've seen through the evolution of our organizational structures is that this utility layer has come to be the reified source of value thinking that has structured our institutions and organizational thinking. So we've got that utility notion of value, which is the grabbing and the getting and the usefulness. We've also heard a lot about reductionism as being a sort of scientific frame. And that has led to increasing fragmentation of knowledge. And I'll speak a little bit more about why that's problematic in things like healthcare, but it's also in other things. Healthcare, health has traditionally been thought of as this sort of harmony of mind, body, and spirit. If you go back or go to the East or go further back in time, this much more holistic notion. But science has allowed us to break down the body into its various parts and subparts and sub-subparts. So we now have broken our body into pieces, and there's experts for all the pieces, but no one sees the whole. And we've been progressively doing the same for our mind, breaking it down into neuroscience and firing synapses and neurons, which is dissolving our sense of self. So this fragmentation of knowledge around who we are and what we are has contributed to this confusion of how we look after ourselves or how we support each other in a more holistic health sense. But also this instrumentalization of knowledge, this sort of lower value layer of Shaler's hierarchy, has led really to the creation of organizations, as Carla was speaking, which think about this thing, what they do in a very mechanistic way. So can we build something? Can we scale it? And how do we use more technology to scale more effectively the stuff that we do? Inside that logic is usually the one of making money. And making money can be done from all sorts of ways, from creating really valuable things that nurture and honor the people you serve, or you can make money through persuasive marketing, through dumping your pollution in the river while no one's looking and pushing it off balance sheet, creating what we call externalities. Unfortunately, on top of those industry models has come finance models, like who's making the most money? Investors will come along and say, well, they will get better return from this company versus that company. But of course, if that company is getting better returns because it's dumped stuff in the river and it's treating its employees badly and it's lying through its advertising, those things are invisible to money. So money flows where more money is made. So we get this systemic attraction to funding and investing in things that make money, irrespective of the harm they may be doing to the wider world and to us. So value extraction has become a central theme for how a lot of our organizations and institutions and economy works, as we know. Now, why is this important? Well, for many, many reasons. It's about to get even more important. This is partly to do with the fifth joint point, in so much as that we are standing at the dawn of the greatest changes in science, medicine, in human history. Whatever came before, we're seeing a rapid acceleration. A large part of that is AI, not just in large language models, but because AI itself is now a tool being used to accelerate the forefront of almost every frontier in innovation. So whether it's new materials or whether it's nuclear fusion or it's next generation chipsets or robotics or weaponry or whatever it might be, including good stuff like the understanding of how proteins work and the generation of new medications and treatments that could solve lots of diseases. AI is now itself becoming a more powerful tool that's accelerating all these frontiers. So we're going to see much more powerful technology appearing into the world very, very quickly. So how is that technology going to be used? What's it going to be in service of? What are the ideologies and the approaches our institutions have when they put this technology to use? Because whatever we're doing, for good or bad, is going to get accelerated dramatically, which is why this conversation is really important. I really like this Taoist philosopher, Zhangzi, I was introduced to a little while back, and he's from 2,500 years ago. And his observation about technology was, be careful of technology. If you engage with reality, with nature, with ourselves, then you're in right relationship. Well, there's a possibility of being in right relationship with reality. But as soon as you start to introduce technology to mediate with reality and with each other, your focus shifts from that relationship to the technology. The technology is the tool that then is doing the relationship with the world. And as you shift your attention from engaging with reality to engaging with the tools, so the danger becomes that technology creates what he called machine minds and machine hearts. We're now relating to our technology, not to the reality that the technology is now engaging with. So let's quickly move on to the meta crisis. I'm going to give a very high level treatment of this. So as I mentioned, the meta crisis is really a way of formulating what are the underlying sort of generators to all the crises that we're seeing at the moment. And obviously the environmental crisis, the climate crisis, increasing inequalities, that we see political tensions building around the world. There's greater dissatisfaction and cracks appearing. The polycrisis is the crisis of crises. So one of the reasons is this acceleration of technology. It's putting fuel on to the very systems that are through their externalities causing harm. So we've got narrow AI as tool. We've also got appearances, we know, of artificial general intelligence, and there's a lot of discussion in this corner of the internet about what that portends. But we do see rapid advances in that area, so we need to think very carefully about that. We also have these coordination and traps in that where does collaboration make sense and where does competition make sense? We compete with each other too much, I would argue, whether it's for bonuses within departments or cross departments or cross the organization or between organizations or across countries. There's a lot of competition, and competition leads us to accelerate the power of our capabilities, which means that we often marshal technology and put it to use as fast as we can to get ahead of the other guy. Now, when we start bringing exponentially powerful technologies into that game, we're at the risk of accelerating the possibility of running off the edge of the cliff ever more quickly. We also got this tragedy of the commons. Daniel Schmachtenberg and others talk about that. If we don't fish this part of the ocean, then the other guy's going to do it and get all the money, so we might as well do it before them, et cetera, et cetera. So we see that in the AGI wars at the moment, that Microsoft, with their relationship with OpenAI, have spearheaded a fierce competition to who's going to get ahead, who's going to win the game of AGI, which is pushing the technology ever faster in ways that compromise the ability to do this and steward this safely. So the spirit, if you like, of competition and misaligned coordination, or Moloch, as some are calling it, are almost like a hyper agent that's underneath that, encouraging us to run faster to the edge of the cliff. As well as the meta crisis, we've got the meaning crisis, of course, which John has talked extensively about. This, in part, exacerbated by our structures and the stresses and fragmentation we're seeing in the world, and social media contributing to that. The loss of shared meaning structure, the sense of the world no longer feels like a place I feel at home in, which is leading to poorer mental health, a kind of loss of meaning in my life and purpose in life, and increasing levels of addiction as a kind of compensatory response to that. So we're seeing a lot of those kind of issues. So one of the things that I like about Forrest's Forrest Landry's framing of this. He said, like, what do we do about this? And, something about the third attractor has come into the lexicon, like we can over control everything and we get into sort of dystopias of total surveillance, or we just let things rip and then these existentially powerful technologies fall into the wrong hands and we all are blowing ourselves up. But something about this future is at the biggest level, I think, comes into sight. And Forrest has really talked about this as sort of man, machine, and nature, or humanity, technology, and nature, which is to say whatever that we're building and however things are like to unfold, surely we could agree that a good direction to go in is that makes possible human flourishing. If we're not aiming at human flourishing, if we're aiming at more human extraction or servitude or inequalities, that isn't likely to be a future that we're going to be desirable, especially when we put exponential tech into that. So a flourishing humanity, on a flourishing planet. Because if we don't have a flourishing planet, a flourishing humanity becomes impossible, because the very substrate on which the game of a flourishing humanity can be made possible is not possible. So the question then comes, what about this technology? Because as we've seen, the technology often manifests itself through our organizations and institutions, and they have developed an organizing logic which has then led them to act in ways that become extractive of us as people and extractive of the environment, which is why we're seeing these crises. Our technology writ large, which it means sort of politics, economics, health systems, international supply chains, energy systems. So I'm talking about technology as tech name writ large, was designed originally because it was going to be in service of us, but its organizing logic has made it increasingly extractive of us. So the big challenge for the future really is how to bring our technology back into service of a flourishing humanity on a flourishing planet. If we get that piece right, then there's, if you like, the biggest holon of all has a chance to sustain itself. And the question then is, if that's the orientation, if that's the North Star, how can we take the learnings of that and bring that down to our lower level considerations of our health systems, our education system, our organizations, our businesses, our economy? How do we internalize that orientation to help guide us towards using more expansive and powerful technology, but in ways that support these sort of meta goals? Another way of saying that is that we need a radical new orientation to care. It is to care for humanity and for life. And this needs to run through, I think, the sort of very core of our thinking. So again, sort of Shayla's hierarchy manifesting itself potentially in a secular way, that for our own survival and the stewardship of the planet, that we do need to be thinking in these terms. So let's drop down and say, well, what does this mean for something like how would we apply this? So I've been doing a lot of work in the UK on health systems. And remember that they're highly fragmented and highly sided around bits of the body, bits of disease. Healthcare is rising at around about 4 to 5% a year. If we just keep our healthcare systems as they are, we've got more chronic disease, more older people, and more things to prescribe. So over the next 10 or 15 years, if it goes like that, we're going to double our healthcare systems, which is going to bankrupt most governments. It's about 10% of GDP in Europe, and it's coming on 20% in the US. That's $4 trillion a year and growing, soon to be 30%. How do we address this? Well, this is where I've been doing work with health systems to say, we can't just keep bolting bits of tech onto all our legacy things, hoping that we'll get there. What we need is a new way of thinking. So I was commissioned to write a report, which was basically saying, can we look at all the mega trends in healthcare, roll them forward, and imagine they've all landed at scale? What could a 21st century integrated holistic healthcare system look like? And if we reverse engineer back from there, what would need to be true, what would need to be true, back to now, a pathway to a future is revealed. And new way of thinking about strategy, rather than squeezing more juice out of what we've got, reimagining what we've got to be in the service of the public. So this involves going right back to first principles. What do we mean by health? And this is where systems biology, which fits very well with the UTOK framework, say that health isn't just about a bunch of organ-based diseases. It is looking at the body as a complete, complex adaptive systems, from genes right the way up to whole bodies. But we exist in our lives in a context and social context. And therefore, health is really all of those things together as a complex adaptive system. And it's about not just not being sick, but as we can see from the WHO definition, it's really about human flourishing. So laying that out, what I've been working with the system on is that if we think about that holistically, sort of cells to cities, all of those things across there are all contributory factors. And if we can see that as an entire system, that they all contribute to individual and collective health, we have an opportunity to reframe health as a collective enterprise that addresses all of these dimensions in a more holistic way. And increasingly what's coming down the road is the ability to capture more data around all of this. And if we got the vision and ambition, we can bring that together to start to see and model what's going on with individuals and collectives, and therefore orchestrate the action of multiple stakeholders around that. Now, to do that well, and this is builds on some of Carla's work, we can't just pull things together and push them at people. How does this manifest itself has to be done in a deep understanding of what matters to people. There's a phrase going around the healthcare system, which I think is quite powerful, the transition from what's the matter with you, to what matters to you. And that's a very different frame around how we start orchestrating more and more pieces together in a more holistic health way of doing it. The last couple of frames, a lot of this is going to involve exponential data, a lot of it real time. And of course, health can't cope with this. So working with Google DeepMind and others to say, well, what would we do in a future healthcare system? We have exponential amounts of data. And the answer came back, you start to think about healthcare records being a digital twin, a simulation of the person that has all the pieces together. So what we're doing is modeling the complexity. And that digital twin then can be really valuable to enable a bunch of healthcare actors to coordinate their action together around a common understanding of what's happening with that person or populations, if you scale that up. And if you flip it the other way around, that digital twin, once it's got large language models and other way, can become a digital health coach that then sits with and owned by the citizen to help them with a broad range of redirecting them and signposting them and supporting them for life course issues, around also a range of health and well-being and sickness issues. So holistic health can start to come to fruition through a combination of a digital twin model that supports a joined up healthcare system and a digital health coach facing of that supports people in the context of their own health. Bringing all of that together, why should we think holistically and systemically? Well, healthier people cannot be supported by lots of fragmented discontinuities, siloed activity. It's only through coming together as a joint health system. If we do that well, we have the potential not just to treat sickness, but really contribute to a healthier society. It's a better, healthier economic, more productive workforce. We can start to get deeper into disadvantaged communities and health inequalities and understand what that means. If we sense into that and understand what works, we can use this to drive insight, to drive further collaborative action around multiple stakeholders, to drive better services that drive greater insight, that we start to create a virtuous flywheel, if you like, of insight and learning and improved capability. And that's going to, if you unpack that a little bit, it's going to be supporting people through their life course in a holistic way, and it's going to involve greater levels of coordination, collaboration, and partnership across sectors within the private sector, within the public sector, and the third sector, working together, pulling together the right partnerships to address what is needed for a healthier, better population. So these are some of the ideas that we're now bringing into fruition. So I've been working with a healthcare system just this morning, piece of the NHS that looks after 1.5 million people, where we had hospitals, primary care, social care, mental health, voluntary groups, local councils in the room, thinking about what our shared future could look like in something of that model. And it offers, I think, a potential to start pointing our institutions back at what's in service of a flourishing humanity. How do we bring our institutions into a frame that affords us an opportunity in a direction that leads to, hopefully, to something of a better tomorrow? So that's the end. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Andy. I work in a healthcare system, so depending on our Q&A, I can talk about some of the problems and to your point about value, I think is very important. So, Waldemar, last but not least, he is a professor emeritus at Oregon Health and Science University in Portland, Oregon. After retiring from a career in academic medicine, specifically pathology, he has attended continuing education in and writing on human psychology and psychiatry, as well as psychotherapy, over the past 15 or more years. In the course of that endeavor, he has become a member of the Society of Theoretical and Philosophical Psychology, the APA division, and he is, in addition, a member of the Theory of Knowledge Society, wherein he is also serves as a member of that society's executive committee. He's the author of multiple presentations, peer-reviewed articles, in numerous medical journals, the founder and past editor of Cytopathology Annual, past officer of the Panopticon Society. Sorry, I butchered that. And the author of Principles and Techniques in Surgical Pathology. And having talked with Waldemar, he's definitely aspirational as a retired physician. I'm 50, so hopefully not close to retiring, but to how to stay productive and flourish in increasingly valuable ways. So with that, Waldemar, why don't you take us through your presentation?
Okay, we shall do that. Awesome. Now I need to find the share screen. Are you ready to go, Baron?
Yeah, we're ready to go. And I think if you do you have the option to share screen?
I do. Okay. I will click that.
Yep, go for it.
And so I bid you all good morning. It's still morning here on the west side of the United States, from a forest in Oregon. And Baron has given me a very kind and nice introduction. Basically, what happened to me was that I finished residency and all sorts of training, but by the time I got pretty far along in my career, it became apparent to me that I didn't know very much about psychology or psychiatry, and somehow got hooked up with Greg and with the Theory of Knowledge Society. So I'm kind of in between the archaeologists who would tell us how things were and the philosophers who say how things could be, in the sense that my proclivities in training are to find out what works. And so I asked myself, what is working? How are we doing with what we are doing? Let me start with mentioning about cultural and consilience. Culture is important because it plays such a supersized role in what we feel, what we think, and what we do, in our behavior, in other words. Consilience is simply abductive reasoning, which is taking a bunch of information from different sources and coming up with a whole that seems to make sense. To me, that's what Carla and Andy were talking about in their particular areas. So I asked myself, how are we doing? And Andy really covered this very well. We are in a meta-crisis, at least, a crisis of crises. There's just too many darn things going on. And I want to put some temporal context on this. Let's see. I would like to get this bigger. Okay. In a temporal context, at some point in time, our sun is going to go through red giant to white dwarf. That's something to worry about, but maybe not just this weekend. I think we can get through it. So, in terms of the crises that are more demanding, look at on the left-hand side, what are called the digital identity problems, the meaning crisis, the mental health crisis. And these are color-coded so that the red ones are things that are already going on right now. And then the more tan things or lighter things are things which are in process. So we have a crisis, as Andy pointed out, with how do we deal with our technology and the environment at the same time? Probably not very well right now. And we have a digital globalization crisis, which all of us as individuals are facing in some extent or another. For instance, is it wise for children primary school age to have cell phones? And how do you control what they can get access to? Because there's a lot of stuff on the internet, as you well know, that really young kids, even adults, don't need to get in touch with. So on the right side, we have a number of things affecting the whole of the human ecology system, like climate change and massive biodiversity loss. We also struggle with democracy versus autocracy. That's an argument which has been going on for a number of years. We have, at least in our country, we have a troubled educational system. We have a troubled political system. We have lots of racial tension and mass shootings. We have multiple worldwide conflict that we as a nation face. There is international financial stress. And the thing that we just barely got over was the pandemics. So my answer is that we are doing so-so. As a species, we aren't doing that well. So one of the ways, let's see, I have a bunch of stuff standing in the way. We can look at this as through the tree of life, the unified theory of knowledge. So somewhere back there about 13 or 14 billion years ago, apparently there was a big bang. And in time, matter condensed out of the hot plasma. And in time, life became apparent. And in time, the creatures that were alive, at least some of them, had minds of some sort or another. A particular set of creatures have a very complicated mind, which they use to create a culture. So, joint points. Please think of joint points as a process. When we look back in time, something that happened 700 million years ago looks like it happened right away. But actually, these joint processes take time to evolve. And to think about joint processes, what they do is they give rise to something which is far more complicated and varied than that which existed before. So out of the matter came life. So the fifth joint point is the one that we're facing now, probably because all of these crises are occurring at one time. Think of joint points in a couple of examples. One is the sperm and the egg. By themselves, they are pretty ho-hum cells that really don't do very much except exist. But once they are combined, something entirely different has occurred. That's a transition point. The next transition point for that thing which occurred is, of course, birth. So the fifth transition point helps us to get through to what has been named the emerging digital global plane. So it's a process. So it's a process about change in culture. And I need to mention a couple of ideas here. One is culture with a big C, capital C, meaning the whole mass of cultures on this earth, as opposed to capital small c culture, the individual cultures. There's the American culture, there's a British culture, there's the Islamic culture. Individual persons have cultures. My culture is slightly different than one of my grandsons who jumps out of an airplane and parachutes into forest fires. That's not part of my culture, and I hope never will be. But changes that we're looking at, the ones that might probably will occur with enough time, they take time. Like information technology, that probably takes 10 years or more. Elon Musk's Neuralink is just brand new. That's not going to solve our problems. And waiting for culture to change in the past has involved combogenesis, the combination of memes in the culture to create new memes, or change in the memes themselves, mutagenesis, if you will, or the creation of absolutely new memes, meme genesis. But all of those take time, and we don't have time. We don't have time because the crises we're facing, they're ongoing right now. And just climate change alone, that's probably going to get worse and worse as time goes on at the rate in which we're going. So what sort of a transition point do we need? What sort of a transition point are we trying to get through? We've used magic in the past. That was a transition point to understand the world and life. We've used myth in the same way. We've used science in the same way, although that got us into the problem of separating the natural sciences from the social sciences, which, by the way, consilience in the uniform theory of knowledge takes care of that and puts together those two parts. So it looks like we need something else than waiting for change to occur or trying something that we have done in the past. For me, the something else is related to work that Anderson is doing and the Nordic Bildung about polymodernism and modernism. Their idea is to take good things out of each culture and use them together for a better product. But I don't think that's going to be enough. When we talk about change in culture, we're talking about change that has to occur on the individual level and change that needs to occur on the collective level. Those two are very different. So let's look at cultural consilience. The current state that we have is a whole series of cultures which have evolved and which are sort of haphazardly mixed together. And that has resulted in the chaos that we're looking at. We just don't get along all that well. We're still a very homicidal species. But cultural consilience is the idea that change will occur with the union of the best cultures of the past and the present. The best cultures being that collection of practices which generates, enhances, promotes, and protects that which results in biosphere, dignity, and well-being. That includes us, as well as a bunch of other species, as well as geosphere well-being, like climate change, like the environmental conflicts that we face, the pollution that occurs. So if we put the best of all things together, then perhaps we can do better as individuals and as a group. For us as individuals, I use Greg's mantra here to be that which enhances dignity and well-being with integrity. Dignity being the right of a person to be valued and respected for their own sake and to be treated ethically. So we know, and we have talked ad nauseum about how dignity is the foundation of human rights. And we have written down those human rights in lots of different ways. But we have trouble applying them as a collective. And I think we get back to what the individuals need to do in terms of the fifth transition point. We can see some things that can be done. For instance, individuals are responsible for the biosphere, what happens to it and where it's going and whether or not it will continue. Hopefully it will. We also have individual responsibilities to the geosphere. That is, what are the things that we are doing to protect it, to make it better, to clean it up? But as groups, we have responsibility to protect and provide and support and manage and maintain both the biosphere and the geosphere. The well-being, which Greg's mantra brings up, is dependent upon both the individual and various social cultural structures, the collective, promoting, sustaining, and applying individual and group rights. And if each of us can practice to be that which enhances dignity and well-being with integrity, we're going to influence how the groups of individuals work and the outcome of their work, such as what Carla and Andy spoke about. So there is a fifth joint point. We are somewhere within it. And we do have some changes that need to be made, both on the collective and the individual level. So with that, I will end, I think, the share system. Yep, there we go. No, to end the share system. Aaron, how do we end the share system?
It's at the top of the screen, Waldemar.
It should be right on the top middle for you, Waldemar.
If
you hit exit on your keyboard to stop full screen.
Okay. It doesn't work on the Mac that way.
So anybody has a Mac user. There you go.
Okay. So
that's what we're here for, to help each other out. Okay.
Okay.
I mean, I think that,
we can get
yeah.
this.
So we're off the shared screen, and Waldemar, that was an excellent overview of where UTOK would fit in. What do we do as we're in this time of the fifth joint point? So all three of you did amazing work. I think if anything, right, it's like keeping the humility that we know that we don't know the answers. The answers are emerging and that we have to work together. That's like the one clear thing. There is no one person or entity that has all the answers that can get it figured out. But together we got one hell of a chance. And so this was great. I I did see a set of questions that Peter Hayward had brought up, and then I did have some comments. I do know we have about 30 minutes. So how about this? If other questions come up, please let me know. I will go ahead and just like comment what Peter had asked, and then I've got plenty of comments I could kind of go back and forth, but I don't want to eat the time unless people don't have questions. I did see Peter had asked, Andy, this is powerful, perhaps empowering way of framing the meta crisis context. Are you further framing health futures as an outcome of successfully managing the meta crisis and or more as the active potential attractor for human flourishing through reperceiving health? Maybe you will have answered this by the end. I think you did a great job of that, but I want to give you a chance to respond to that question as well.
Yeah, thank you very much, Baron. Thanks for the excellent question, Peter. Well, I probably see this at two levels. What I was trying to do is sort of point to the biggest possible level and some ideas around the framing that might orient us collectively towards a direction that might make possible a sustainable future for humanity. This idea of a sort of flourishing humanity and a flourishing planet with our techne brought in service of that. And then really thinking how do we internalize that down to the sort of holons that sit underneath that? And one of those, of course, is health itself. I think the fascinating area of health is of all the particular sectors, if we think about it in that term, it's one of the ones that has the most impact on us. Without our health, we're really struggling to do anything. And health is such an important part of our institutional landscape. So health is one where if we can bring this sort of orientation to human flourishing alive in a healthcare context, it almost provides an exemplar or an example, if you like, of how we can start to rethink what our institutions are doing to be in service of the well-being of the commons rather than extracting from the commons. I know in the US it's probably a little more tricky to do that because of the financialized interest of the players who do very well out of the current system. But in a lot of these other sort of government-funded services, there is a business model, if you like, that wants to see reduced costs. So there's a kind of orientation and energy within the system that's searching for new answers. So I'm really looking at how we can use health to bring forth that desire to do something better and manifest that in an experience that hopefully will resonate more widely into other sectors. That's my sort of bigger hope.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I would take a moment, just Andy, to say I really appreciated the point about why should we care and what do we value, and kind of that Scheller's hierarchy. And I'd never seen it in that framework of left and right hemisphere applied to value in that way. So I thought that was really illustrative of how do we get to a place of care, and what are the implicit schemas that may serve as barriers or facilitators to actually look at higher order value, right? So I thought that was great. And then I do see we have Brandon had a question. It looks like this is more general. Do you have recommendations for working toward cultural change as a means of facilitating the needed organizational and institutional changes in order to address these systemic challenges? So I would leave that open to our panel, if anybody wanted to take a stab at that. It's either Andy, Waldemar, or Carla, if there's anything that came to you for that. Recommendations for working towards cultural change as to facilitate organizational institutional change. Yeah, that's the money shot question in many ways.
Well, I'm happy to have a go, but I've already answered one question. So if anyone else wants to, like, Carla, do you want to go for this one?
Yeah, Carla, why don't you chime in?
Sure. I mean, the short answer is it's really difficult. But that list of practices, I think, helps to dislodge some of the culture, because really what I'm talking about here is changing the culture of decision making inside the department I work in, inside the broader civil service. So it's a culture change problem. In fact, one of the problems that I see is people divorcing the way in which decisions get made from culture. No, all intertwined. It's all culture, person, plane stuff. And so some of the more tangible things that I seem to think will be, you can communicate within the current dialogue that gets people to shift, are those things. So moving away from PowerPoint presentations towards visualization software, moving away from simply seeing analysts as people who answer questions to seeing scientists as people who ask questions and craft questions. So I'm taking some inspiration from the fact that the agile movement came into government and has transformed not only the way that we implement technological change, but actually the way in which we do design wider services. Now, what led to that change? Well, in itself, that was borrowing from some of the sort of things that were going on in the wider private sector and beyond. But it was also a particular political part of the political class got attached to the idea of agile and thought this was a way to improve things. So it has to sort of come from outside government, some from inside government, some from the politicians who we serve. And there's a very strange relationship, but it works in Britain between this permanent apolitical civil service and the politicians who both ultimately are accountable for the way the civil service works and can change it, but it is made. They don't sort of sweep everybody away and bring in a new lot when an election is held, like is my impression for much of the US. So I would say those are my sort of initial answers to that question, which is the right question. I've been thinking more about what's the role of leadership in that, and whether we need to, maybe we could create leadership schemes, classes, training that both provide not only a kind of with authority, here is the way that you should do this, but also provide the opportunity for people in senior positions to all support each other to do things in this different way. And this is harnessing an existing interest within the systems of leadership. There's a million books in the airport and plenty of civil servants read them about the importance of leadership. And a lot of that stuff, as a psychologist, I say is not that useful. But the fact that there's a market for it, can we harness that? And the idea, we go and get trainings to do our jobs. Well, actually, we're creating culture here. Could we use those opportunities to feed in some of these practices that I have sort of been part of a movement of people discovering work better, to export some of these learnings into that wider institutional change? But it's the $1 million question, multi-million dollar question.
And I would comment off of that, Carla. I enjoyed everybody's talk. I enjoyed your part in many ways. One thing that comes to mind out of this is the industrial model and machine metaphors, and that those being a big barrier. So even where I work in the USA, there's kind of this running metaphor of like people are treated like widgets. And so from a top-down level, widgets might be a way to model people, but people do not like to be treated like a widget, and they do not perform well in their health and well-being as a worker. And to your point, additionally, to take that systemic focus and having the capacity to zoom in and zoom out, right? As you mentioned, you gave that example of person who needed to take care of other people. And so it's like tied to this much higher chain. And I do see that as, I've said to my own students, it's a blessing and a curse to have systemic thinking, because if you're doing it, you see things in a very different way, but you may be challenged when people in leadership are not. So it's very thankful that you are in a place of influence, that you have some capacity to make that change. And just another meta comment of, and then Andy is kind of doing work outside the system and trying to give an approach to try to make these changes, and then trying to tie that in. And part of how do you leverage big data, exponential data in ways where AI could be quite useful, rather than, as you had said, Carla, rather as an ability to remove human decision making, but ideally to, in many ways, enhance or influence optimum decision making. And then there's a top down, and then I would mention the bottom up that Waldemar brings up, that while there needs to be both, right? And so Waldemar talking about the bottom up individual, and so and my shameless plug is I do a talk tomorrow about, at an individual level, some of that transformative change that where we take in these models and frameworks that transform us, and we actually care to the point that we care about everything and everyone. So anyway, I interrupted you, Andy. So please chime in. Sorry.
No, that was a good bridge to what I was going to say. I was going to introduce care. So the hierarchical mechanistic machine model that so dominates our structures of organization, borrowed from industry and often appears in health and public as well, is often has power that directing things, or by function of its machine nature, it's much more transactional in terms of the way it does things. The internal bureaucracy is very transactional, and the way that services are delivered to the public can often be quite transactional products delivered to them. And if we're really going to be interested in human flourishing, and we have to go from transactional thinking to relationship thinking, and relationships based on care. What is it that people need? What is it that will make their lives better? What is it that we could be doing better? If we're not curious and in that relationship, we can't bring that insight back to inform the organization institution what it could be doing better to support the people it's there to serve. And what I've seen from the work I'm doing is that once you can distill those insights and share them in the organization, now people are not just doing tasks, they're participating in a collective enterprise to do something valuable for people. And people get very much more animated if they can see purpose in the work they're doing. They're not just carrying out tasks to take a paycheck and go home. They're collectively contributing to something that makes the world a little bit better. And that can have an animating effect on culture. And when we look at the different generations entering the workplace at the moment, the younger generation in particular want to work for an organization that's doing something meaningful. They're not happy enough, or they're not prepared so much to come up and do tasks for money and go home. That was kind of the older generations were just having to get a job. The younger generation want to have meaningful work. So if an organization can create that atmosphere, they will have more creative people. The best people will probably want to work for them. So it's a self-fulfilling way of improving the quality of the services that we offer, and the ability of the organization to respond and be more successful. I think Sigurd has had his hand raised for quite some time.
I've seen that. He's popped in and out. Go for it. We're ready for your question.
So I've wanted to distill something from all of these conversations, and something in particular is that we have a culture of disconnection. And there have been cultures of disconnections for thousands of years that have actively tried to wipe out cultures of connection. So that sense of disconnection just runs through all of this for me. In the healthcare systems, you're divided up into persons who look at the liver or the heart or the lungs or whatever, and don't pay attention that I've heard that stress is the most common and growing reported problem behind all the visits to the medical system. But the medical system doesn't look at stress. It looks at the particular symptoms and how to deal with the symptoms.
Absolutely.
So, and cultures traditionally are in concert with nature, with the natural world. And in our culture of disconnections, we have lost that connection with the natural world. And that in itself is a kind of trauma that is hidden, that is, again, behind so much of what is manifest as poor health. I think I've said enough coachedly. Not sure I could continue to be that. So.
Well, I think that's beautiful. In a very practical, hands-on, I deal with this every day. I'm a neuropsychiatrist and do mostly brain stimulation. So people ask me, I kind of will say I'm a brain electrician from the UTOK-minded people. I'm a Mind One firmware specialist. And but by the way, lower levels minds have higher levels of mind. And a justified experiential self, a culture person that's embedded. We're a minded animal embedded in not only our culture, but the ecology of life, et cetera. And when we don't have systemic thinking, when we have disconnection, we then get even disassociation. And so I not uncommonly will talk about, we have, just as an individual could have dissociative identity disorder, I talk about institutional dissociative disorder, where like we, even within an institution, you were just talking about stress and health and different organ systems. Well, you even have this finance system, at least within the US, that is totally dissociated from what's actually happening. It's like a higher order abstraction of widgetization, which has become completely dissociated. And so somebody like me at a lower level in the health system, try to recreate that sense of culture and connection, purpose. I talk with my team, run a team of doctors and nurses, and over a couple of clinics, and we talk about it's patients first, people second. So each one, the team second, and then third, the individual. So you're on the list, you're just number 3. While we are actively helping people get out of, say, for example, very severe depressive states, then that's where we try to bring online the approach and idea of like moving your body, cultivating healthy relationships, cultivating a sense of purpose, a notation that our culture is sick, that we're running in a way where people are having to work so hard to try to make ends meet and always have to feel pressured to do more. Like that's illness, that's sick. And so while we're doing brain stimulation, we're doing all this other stuff on the side, and people love us, right? I mean, we have highest marks in the entire university system. People donate money to our cause of what we're trying to do. And I at least look at that as our place in trying to make a ripple and change. Like this, at least in my view, this cultural system change has to occur top down, bottom up, in the middle. Everybody has a role. The scariest thing to me would be for people younger than me to feel that they had no choice or ability to make change in the world. And that's the exact opposite, right? That's when we should be afraid. But actually, if people just start with where they're at, start with themselves and their sphere of influence, it's making a difference, right? Even just a subset of us here now are making a difference, right? So anyway, that's my little monologue off of that. But
so one of the interesting things I've seen from a systems level, if I can just come in here, is it's something that Hannah Arendt talked about in her Banality of Evil, which was perhaps the most vivid example of that, which is, were all Germans possessed by evil psychopathic behavior? Or, as from the Adolf Eichmann trials, her observation is that Adolf Eichmann, but probably a lot of Germans would say, no, I was just doing my job. I was doing my little piece. And when I considered what I was doing in the narrow confines of what I do, I was doing some admin, I was doing some HR, I was doing some repairing of trucks or whatever it might be. That whole systems can do great harm to us, but most of the people in them would feel I'm not doing anything wrong. In fact, so what we can find is a lot of our systems are doing harm. They are quite extractive. They are causing harm to humanity or to the planet. But most of the people in them would probably not perceive that they're doing anything wrong. But they're participating and energizing a system that then is doing harm on a greater scale. So I think one of our challenges is, how do we create a greater consciousness so that people, when they're working for organization, don't just see it as going to do some tasks to get some money, but there's an ethical choice in which organization they choose to participate in that. So taking that up, Richard Floridi, I think is an ethical philosopher who's also talked about how even industries can be like that. For example, the fast food industry, each one of them would justify, oh, we're providing food at low cost to people who can't afford it. And that, we're not doing anything bad. But if we create an industry where everyone starts copying because there's a business model in there, we end up with an obese nation with masses of sickness and suffering, where no one feels they've made an ethical poor decision, but the collective action is actually doing harm. So when we're thinking about ethics and values, it's not just at the individual organizational level. We need to become more conscious about what we're doing at the societal level. I think that's a really important piece to put on the table.
That's beautiful, Andy. Waldemar, I know you had your hand up a moment ago.
Yeah, I would like to comment. Sitting here, my approach is to find the fundamental problem. So when you have a sick patient, you work on the fundamental problem. Is it a bacterium or a virus? Is it a tumor? The fundamental problem to me is what people are doing. And I hear this theme over and over again from all three of you, Carla, Andy, and Baron, that as I look at it, each of you is in fact promoting that which is well-being and dignity with integrity. Now, you might not agree that you're perfect at it. I know I'm not perfect at it, but this idea that what the individual brings to the group really influences what the group ends up doing. They take on the assumptions and the inferences that the group of individuals have brought there, and they work out some way by which they can live with what they're doing. Right now, it's pretty obvious that we might not be able to live with what we're doing. I just want to say that the idea that the individual faces promoting well-being and dignity with integrity, it's easy to say, but it's actually very difficult in practice. It takes a lot of hard work, and it takes more than a little bit of courage to do that. Our world, at least the world that I live in here in America, doesn't really value that right now. There isn't a place for that. And it'll only become a place if we insist that there's a place for that.
That's beautiful. Yeah. And Waldemar, I think that is a critical point of what the individual brings influences the group. The kind of the aspirations that we aim for, we may not have perfected. And as a recovering perfectionist, like, it's okay, right? We do not have to be perfect at this stuff. That's actually the freedom of that we are imperfect, right? And so then we can just work and do our best and be where we are. And in our movement, and that is dialectic of sorts. So, yeah, thank you for that.
I think a part of that challenge is also as we see, it's the meaning crisis, isn't it? The evacuation of any shared story of why we're here and what we're doing together. We've collapsed down into, material well-being as our story, and even that's now failing to deliver. And this kind of vacuum of meaning, this sense of anxiety that then can easily see people turning on each other. But what's the shared story that represents the aspirational shared future that we can collectively work towards, that sees others not as the other, but as part of a collective story, a collective family of us together on a journey somewhere? And without that story, it's very easy to see things cracking and falling apart, and othering of the other becomes the new norm. We find our sanctuary in defending ourselves against others rather than embracing them as in a collective enterprise for something better. So what is the story, I think, for the future is part of what's missing, which is obviously central to the meaning crisis thesis that Greg and John are looking at.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I always wondered, actually, as maybe a 20-something-year-old, some version of like why was big history, some version of it, not like part of our collective story? Why did that not really capture deeper in our culture? Which I think, I don't know the answer to that, but I think part of it is because people have to feel it, right? It has to be an emotive experience. It can't be just an intellectual thing of the universe was 13.8 billion years ago and life is 5 billion and humans, that it's like you are literally, we are all influencing and being influenced by other people. We are a minded animal connected with all of life, right? Even the first life on the planet. We are a distinct wholeness, right? Each one of us is in a sense, a feature of existence, right? A focal feature, kind of our own little vortex in the river. And all of a sudden, when we can know, I would argue, when we can know ourselves as that, we all of a sudden care about everyone. A level of our being cares about everyone and everything. And we can still have an ego and persona, right? And that thing can get in the way sometimes. But that's where there's work to be done too, right? And that's okay. Yeah, but I don't know what is, other than those kind of suggestions of some type of variation of a naturalistic big history 2.0. I don't know what else kind of connects people at that larger value. What moves them to care in everyone.
Well, I think part of that is a shared history of where we've come from, but there's also the forward-looking, the shared story of who we are and where we're going. And certainly we've increasingly turned our back on our big histories, and we're looking to critique it and undermine it and sort of cut it to pieces and leave us stranded. As some philosophers talk, it's like with the young now, it's like planting a cut flower, expecting it to grow. We chopped all the roots off and thinking that it will grow. But if looking forward, we see fear, we see collapse, we see dystopias, then that's not an invitation to participate in a shared story of the future that I can dedicate my shared effort to. It's one that invites retrenchment and more hostility. So we've got our work cut out.
Yeah, perhaps it's a reminder there is and will be some sort of collapse, and there is and will be some sort of emergence, and that we all have our place in trying to influence more and more of that emergence and minimization of that collapse. That's like arguably perhaps a duty of as a world citizen, right? How can I bring more emergence into the world and reduce the collapse, right? How can I connect with other people in such a way to make this, reason to get up out of bed in the morning, right?
Yes. Well, there's one piece I'd like to put on the table as well, which I think is interesting. It doesn't answer the whole question, but I think it raises the possibility for some more positivity. And that's the work of Mariana Mazzucato, one of the economists based out of the UK. So she's identified that some of the most difficult problems that we face, whether it's inequalities or public health or climate change, a lot of these things are so systemic, they have so much complexity to them that no one institution can solve it. Like all our institutions deliver narrowly conceived products or services, and we're just throwing bits at a hole and wondering why we can't get anywhere. So she said, in those situations, maybe the state could be more entrepreneurial and say, well, let's frame this problem. Let's understand it in more holistic terms. And let's put some policy and some funding behind it and invite pieces of the public sector and the private sector and academia and the third sector. Let's bring a coalition together because all of you hold pieces of this solution, but until we create a context and a business model, we're not going to get anything off the ground. We're just going to throw bits at it and wonder why things are getting worse. But here's the opportunity, a bit like the moonshot, to bring a coalition together to really start to address some of the things that need to be changed. And I think if we point that type of thinking at some of the problems that we see festering in our societies, we can give each other and others hope that we can mobilize collectively to solve things and create some betterment in the world. So I think there's something interesting in the approach she's advocating, sort of mission-based government, she's calling it. So it's worth checking out her work there, because I think there's something interesting there.
That's
could I chip in real quick on that?
Sure.
Sorry, I didn't get time to raise my hand. No, I completely agree with what you said, Andy, which probably doesn't surprise you. And that's, if I'd had longer to talk about the care choices example, I think that would have been hopefully a good example of exactly that kind of thing, because what we saw was that we had some systems in place for supporting carers, caregivers, but if you didn't identify as such, we even had laws saying you don't have to be, you can get help from your local authority, but people couldn't access that because they didn't know that they were carers or caregivers. So we had a completely oblivious to this whole group. So we identified that this group existed, which is basically every working person with a family tomorrow could be a carer. So you're all potential carers. And what we said was, if we're going to intervene in those early part of the journey where people are making decisions, then we actually, well, not only do we need to bring in the NHS and Department of Health and those earlier touch points that the families will have when they find out that the person is going to need care, but actually what you're going to go to the carers charities. You might, well, actually more likely you might go to Alzheimer's UK, you might go to Parkinson's UK, you might go to these charities where the focus had all been on the patient and not the whole family. So we recognised in leading this work, not only did we need to go beyond a department that was responsible for the workplace and bring in all of these other bits of government, but we need to go beyond government, because individuals are going to look for information in these other places. Oh my God, they've got Alzheimer's. Let me go to Alzheimer's UK. Well, if at that point it could say, hold on, there's going to be a lot of decisions that your family might need to make. And rather than some quite judgmental language about, oh, make sure you treat the person like this, which is, as somebody who's gone through this process herself as a carer, I was sensitive to, hold on, who decided that how people should feel and decide this stuff? So actually, this is a real example of taking the whole set of sectors with us and saying, do we have a problem here? Have we got some unmet user needs? Who do we care about? These people, and we can all agree we care. What are the things that are making their lives not very good? What could improve them? And let's look at all the barriers and pick one thing that we all agree, if we fix that problem, would make a real big difference. And one thing that's relatively easy to do, and the thing that was relatively easy to do was the information that I displayed earlier. That's
beautiful, Carla. Thank you. I realize we ran over time a little bit, couple minutes. So I appreciate all our presenters and the engagement from you and the audience, and look forward to seeing and hearing you all more. So, all right, you guys have a great rest of your time. Thanks.
Thank you, Baron.
Thank you so much. It was really fun.